The encounter. The marble floors of the lobby glistened under the soft glow of designer chandeliers, casting intricate shadows across the walls of the luxurious building. A large potted plant sat in one corner, adding an earthy contrast to the polished steel and glass that dominated the space. It was the kind of place that exuded wealth and exclusivity, designed to make anyone who entered feel like they were stepping into a world apart, a world for the privileged. For a moment, the lobby was alive with the hum of voices and the sound of footsteps. But that moment was abruptly interrupted when the heavy glass doors slid open, and in walked the man. His presence, quiet yet assertive, seemed to fill the space despite his composed demeanor. Clad in a tailored suit that spoke of quiet elegance, his dark skin contrasted sharply with the lightness of the surroundings, but he moved through the lobby with a sense of familiarity, as if the space had always belonged to him. He was a tall man, with sharp features that spoke of a life well lived and well traveled. His eyes, calm and unblinking, scanned the lobby as he approached the elevator. He wasn't a stranger to the building, nor to its inner workings. In fact, he was the one who had made this place what it was. But to the woman seated nearby, he was nothing more than an outsider. She sat near the front desk, her posture rigid and her gaze sweeping the room with an air of superiority. Her perfectly manicured fingers absent-mindedly adjusted the edge of her blazer as she looked around, sizing up the other residents with an air of quiet disdain. She had always thought of herself as someone who belonged in places like this, someone who was above the crowd, untouched by the burdens of those less fortunate. When her eyes fell on the man, a wave of discomfort washed over her. His presence seemed so out of place, so foreign in a world that she considered her own. She was unable to suppress the thoughts that flashed through her mind. Who was he? How did he get in here? And why was he standing there, so confidently, as though he had every right to be? It was then that her judgment began to form, sharp and unforgiving. He must be an intruder, someone who had slipped through the cracks, perhaps a delivery man or a worker sent to do some repairs. The idea that he could possibly be a resident was unthinkable. After all, people like him, people with his skin color, his apparent social standing, didn't live in a place like this. They weren't meant to. Her thoughts grew more intrusive as she watched him move toward the elevator, his steps measured, deliberate. Her gaze followed him, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. She could feel her discomfort growing, the seed of superiority sprouting into something more insidious. The thought that someone like him could be there, sharing the same space, threatened the fragile illusion she had created for herself about the world she inhabited. It wasn't supposed to be like this. She stood up, her heels clicking loudly against the floor as she made her way toward him. She did not walk with hesitation, no, her strides were confident, even aggressive. She was about to assert her dominance, to remind this man of his place in a world that had been carefully constructed for people like her. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "what do you think you're doing here?" Her words were sharp, cutting through the air with a venomous edge. There was no question of kindness, no attempt to understand. Her tone was commanding, laced with an unspoken assumption that he was trespassing in a space that was not meant for him. The man stopped in his tracks, turning slowly to face her. His gaze met hers, unflinching, calm. There was no hint of anger in his eyes, no flash of defensiveness. He simply stood there, waiting. "You're not supposed to be here," she continued, her voice growing colder. "This building isn't for people like you. I don't know how you got in, but I suggest you leave now before I call security." Her words were meant to belittle him, to make him feel small, to remind him of the unspoken rules that govern spaces like this. She believed in her heart that she was doing the right thing, that by asserting her control, she was maintaining the order that belonged to her and others like her. But the man did not react as she expected. Instead of shrinking or apologizing, he stood there, unfazed. His hands were still clasped around the key in his pocket, his posture relaxed. There was no visible tension in his body. It was almost as if he were watching a play unfold, observing the actress deliver her lines. For a brief moment, she was caught off guard. She had expected him to be flustered, to back down. But instead, he simply said, in a voice as calm as the stillness of a lake, "You can call security, but I think you should prepare for a surprise." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning, yet devoid of any hostility. It was a statement of fact, not a threat. It was as if he knew something she didn't, a truth that she could not yet see. The woman, stunned for a brief second, dismissed the comment as nothing more than defiance. She was in control here. She was the one who had the power. She had the privilege of dictating who belonged and who didn't. But even as she raised her hand to grab her phone, something in the pit of her stomach stirred uneasily. Still, she continued, her fingers dialing security with practiced ease. She was sure she was in the right. But as the seconds ticked by, and the man stood there without moving, her confidence began to waver. Something was different about him, something that she couldn't quite put her finger on. But her focus remained on the phone call. Security would come soon, and all of this, her discomfort, his defiance, would be nothing more than a blip in the perfect world she had created for herself. She hung up the phone, still certain of her actions. "Security is on their way," she said, her voice a little sharper now. "You'll regret this." And with that, she turned to walk away, the sound of her heels echoing off the marble as she walked toward the desk, her eyes not meeting his again. But the man remained where he was. He didn't rush. He didn't make a move. He stood still, his silence saying more than words ever could. The woman didn't know it yet, but she had just made a grave mistake. The revelation. The minutes stretched on in the marble lobby, and for the woman, they seemed to crawl by in an uncomfortable silence. Her heels clicked sharply as she made her way back to the front desk, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, her mind still buzzing with the certainty that she had the upper hand. Security would be here any minute, and everything would be put back in order. She would make sure of that. But as she settled back at the desk, her mind kept returning to the man standing by the elevator. There was something unsettling about the way he had looked at her. His calmness, his refusal to cower, was unlike anything she had expected. Most people in his position would have apologized, would have explained themselves in a panic. But not him. No, he had simply stood there, unflinching. And then those words, "You can call security, but I think you should prepare for a surprise." They echoed in her mind, bouncing off the walls of her thoughts, growing louder with every passing second. What had he meant by that? What could he possibly be referring to? She was in control. She was the one who had the power in this situation. Yet, as she sat at the desk, waiting for the security guards to arrive, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had overlooked something. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the elevator doors opening with a soft ding. The woman looked up reflexively, expecting the security guards to step out, ready to escort the man out of the building as she had demanded. But when she saw the figure stepping off the elevator, her heart skipped a beat. It was him. The same man. But this time, there was no look of confusion or discomfort on his face. There was no rush or hesitation in his movements. In fact, he moved with a quiet confidence that seemed to take the air out of the room. Before she could say anything, he walked toward the front desk. The receptionist, who had been completely unaware of the earlier exchange, stood up straight, his face suddenly lighting up with recognition. "Good evening, Mr. Blackwell," the receptionist said, his voice filled with a respectful tone she hadn't expected to hear. The woman's eyes widened as she glanced from the receptionist to the man. She could feel the air in her lungs freeze. Mr. Blackwell? She had no idea who this man was. All she knew was that he had appeared from nowhere, carrying himself with an authority that now seemed to radiate off him. Her pulse quickened, and for the first time since the encounter had started, she felt a twinge of uncertainty. She had spoken to him like an intruder, like someone beneath her, someone who had no place in her world. But here he was, calmly interacting with the receptionist in a way that suggested he owned the space. Still, her pride refused to let her admit any wrongdoing. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, trying to hold on to the security she had built around herself. She watched as Mr. Blackwell continued to interact with the receptionist, who was now handing him a few documents to sign. There was an ease about him, an air of belonging that could not be denied. But the woman's heart sank as she realized something that had never crossed her mind before: this wasn't just any man. This wasn't someone who could be swept away with a simple phone call to security. No. This man had more control over the situation than she could have ever imagined. The receptionist finished speaking with Mr. Blackwell and turned his attention back to the woman, his voice more formal now, as if he were speaking to someone of lesser importance. "Is there anything else I can assist you with, Ms. Howell?" the receptionist asked, his words polite but distant. Ms. Howell's stomach dropped. The receptionist's tone had shifted so subtly, yet unmistakably. There was a new level of respect in his voice, one that she wasn't used to. She suddenly realized that something had shifted in the room, something that had put her on the outside of it. It was as if Mr. Blackwell had some invisible power that the others had recognized but she had failed to see. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words died on her lips. The realization that she had just insulted the building's owner, someone of immense power and influence, had hit her like a ton of bricks. She couldn't undo what had been done, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't erase the words she had thrown at him. As she sat there, her face burning with shame, Mr. Blackwell finally turned to her. He hadn't moved from his place at the front desk. His gaze was steady, unwavering. He wasn't angry, but his eyes carried a weight of something much deeper than irritation. It was as if he could see right through her, as if he understood more than she could ever comprehend. The silence between them seemed to stretch on forever. Ms. Howell shifted uncomfortably in her seat, wishing she could vanish into the floor. But Mr. Blackwell was not done with her yet. His voice, when it finally came, was soft yet commanding, a tone that immediately demanded her attention. "Ms. Howell, I believe you have something to say to me." The words were simple, but they carried a power she could not deny. She opened her mouth to speak, to apologize, but the words felt hollow. How could she apologize for something so deep, so ingrained in her? How could she atone for something that had become part of her identity, the belief that people like him were beneath people like her? I didn't mean to offend you," she said, the words coming out in a half-whisper. "I didn't know." But she trailed off, realizing that her apology, while genuine, would never be enough. Not for someone like him. Not for someone who understood the weight of being seen as lesser, simply because of who they were. Mr. Blackwell didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded, as if giving her permission to continue. But when he finally spoke, his words were not filled with anger, nor did they come with a lecture. He simply said, in a voice so calm and measured that it stunned her, "You can call me Mr. Blackwell, or you can call me a man who holds the power of this building. But I want you to remember this: no one, not you, not anyone, can ever judge a person by the color of their skin or the assumptions they carry. I'll leave the judgment to you." It was a simple statement, yet one that carried an undeniable weight. Ms. Howell felt her face flush again, not from embarrassment, but from the sting of truth. In that moment, she realized that she had been wrong, not just about Mr. Blackwell, but about everything she had believed about the world she inhabited. As Mr. Blackwell turned and walked away, heading toward the elevator, she sat there, her hands trembling slightly. The conversation had ended, but the lesson had just begun. There was more to this man than she had ever imagined, and what she had thought was a simple power play was, in fact, a life lesson. He wasn't here to win or lose. He was here to teach. And in that silence, as he disappeared into the elevator, she knew that this encounter would change her forever. The confrontation. The days following the unexpected revelation had a strange stillness to them. Ms. Howell could feel the weight of what had transpired, settling on her shoulders like an unbearable burden. She had made a grave mistake, a mistake that wasn't simply about her harsh words to Mr. Blackwell. it was about her entire worldview, a worldview built on assumptions, privilege, and deep-seated biases that she had never bothered to question. For the first time, she found herself reflecting not just on what had happened, but on the years of life she had lived without truly seeing people for who they were, only for what she had imagined them to be. As much as she tried to push it to the back of her mind, the encounter with Mr. Blackwell lingered. Every time she walked through the lobby, every time she passed by the elevator, she found herself looking over her shoulder, half expecting him to walk through the door again. But in the weeks that followed, he didn't come down. The lobby remained the same, silent and composed, just as it had always been. But something within her had shifted, something irrevocable, something she could no longer ignore. It was early one morning when she saw him again, this time in the elevator. She was heading up to her apartment, the weight of her own thoughts pressing in on her, when the doors opened, and there he was. Mr. Blackwell. Standing there, as composed as ever, his presence filling the small space of the elevator. She hesitated, the words from their previous encounter still fresh in her mind. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, and for a moment, it was as if time had stopped. The elevator doors were halfway closed, but she pressed the button to keep them open. She didn't know why, but in that moment, she felt the urge to speak, to acknowledge the wrong that she had done, to somehow make amends. Mr. Blackwell, she said softly, her voice unsure but sincere. I owe you an apology. For everything. For what I said that day. For thinking I had the right to judge you. He looked at her, his gaze steady and unflinching, but there was no anger in his eyes, only calm understanding. It was a look that made her feel both vulnerable and exposed, yet oddly reassured, as if she were standing in front of someone who had long ago reconciled with the weight of the world's prejudices. "There's no need to apologize," he replied, his voice as calm as it had been the first time they spoke. What happened that day was more of a lesson than a confrontation. She nodded, swallowing hard. A lesson, she repeated, trying to digest the weight of his words. You made me realize something important. I've been so caught up in my own privilege that I never truly understood the world around me. I assumed things about people, about you, just because of the color of your skin. And I was wrong. Mr. Blackwell didn't say anything immediately. He simply watched her for a moment, his eyes seeming to weigh her words, as if assessing the sincerity behind them. The elevator doors slid shut, and the hum of the machinery filled the quiet space between them. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, but firm. I've learned over the years that the world isn't as simple as we often make it. We all carry our own biases, our own prejudices, and sometimes we don't even realize we're doing it. The important thing is not the mistakes we make, but what we do with them afterward. His words were like a balm, soothing the rawness of her guilt. She could feel the shame inside her start to recede, replaced by something else, a desire to change, to grow, to make amends. You've already learned something valuable, Mr. Blackwell continued, and that's what matters. You've started to question the way you see people, and that's the first step. We all have our own struggles, our own battles. And often, the fight is not with others, it's with ourselves. With the walls we've built around our hearts, the judgments we've passed, and the assumptions we've made. The elevator slowed to a stop, and the doors opened to the floor. Ms. Howell stepped out, her heart a little lighter, but still full of questions. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "For your understanding." Mr. Blackwell gave a small nod, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Don't thank me just yet. The real work begins when we leave behind our comfort zones and step into the unknown. When we choose to unlearn the things that have held us back, and instead learn what it truly means to see each other as equals." With that, he stepped out of the elevator, his confident stride echoing in the silent hallway. Ms. Howell watched him walk away, the gravity of his words settling in her chest. As the elevator doors closed again, she couldn't help but feel that something profound had shifted within her, a change that went deeper than just this encounter, something that would guide her for the rest of her life. She knew she had a long way to go. Undoing the layers of prejudice that had been built up over the years would take time, effort, and humility. But for the first time, she felt that she was ready. She was ready to confront her own biases, to challenge her assumptions, and to become someone who truly saw people for who they were, not for the color of their skin or the assumptions society had placed on them. The lessons that had started in the lobby had only just begun to unfold, and she was determined to make the most of them. In the days that followed, Ms. Howell took small steps. She began to actively listen to the stories of others, of her colleagues, her neighbors, and even strangers she encountered. She opened her heart and mind to new perspectives, to experiences she had once dismissed as irrelevant or distant. She realized how much she had been missing all these years, the beauty of diversity, the richness of different backgrounds, and the wisdom that came from understanding one another. Her conversations changed. The way she interacted with people shifted. She no longer looked at people through the lens of privilege, but through the lens of empathy. She began to see how her actions had affected those around her, how her words could either build bridges or tear them down. And then, one day, she was standing in the lobby once more. This time, there was no judgment in her eyes. No condescension in her voice. Just a quiet sense of awareness, a deeper understanding of the world and its complexities. She smiled at the receptionist, and for the first time, he smiled back, not out of duty, but out of genuine warmth. Her gaze moved across the lobby, and as she did, she saw the people around her, not as strangers, not as inconveniences, but as equals. She saw the man who had once been an intruder in her eyes, the one she had dismissed, standing by the front desk, chatting with the staff with a friendly smile on his face. It was a small moment, but for Ms. Howell, it was monumental. She had learned that the world was not as black and white as she had once thought. It was filled with nuances, with shades of gray, and it was in those nuances that true understanding and connection resided. The journey had just begun, but it was a journey worth taking, one that would reshape not only her understanding of the world, but her place in it. The lesson. Weeks passed since that pivotal moment in the elevator. Each day, Ms. Howell felt herself changing in ways she hadn't expected. The guilt of her earlier actions had faded, but the lessons she had learned from Mr. Blackwell, lessons about empathy, humility, and the importance of truly seeing people, continued to resonate deeply within her. It wasn't enough to simply recognize her mistakes. She knew that true growth meant taking action, showing up with the right intentions, and continually striving to be a better person, both to herself and to those around her. She spent the following weeks reflecting on her interactions, both past and present. She took a more mindful approach to every conversation, every meeting, and every interaction she had with people. She noticed the way people around her spoke, how they treated each other, and how easily judgment could slip into even the most casual exchanges. One afternoon, as she sat in a cafe with a friend, she found herself having a conversation that once would have been filled with assumptions. But now, she actively listened. She heard more than just words, she heard the emotions, the fears, the struggles behind them. She found herself asking deeper questions, seeking to understand instead of just responding. Her friend, sensing the shift in her, raised an eyebrow. "You're different, you know. There's something about you these days that feels more present." Ms. Howell smiled, feeling both gratitude and discomfort at the same time. "I guess I'm finally learning to listen. Really listen. I used to think I knew what people needed, what they were going through, but I never actually asked. I just assumed." She paused, her hands wrapped around the warm coffee mug in front of her. "It's funny, isn't it? How easy it is to think we know everything about others, when we barely know ourselves." Her friend nodded thoughtfully, and the two of them continued talking, the conversation flowing more naturally than it ever had before. For the first time, Ms. Howell felt a genuine connection to the people she spoke with. She wasn't just offering advice or talking about her own experiences, she was actively participating in someone else's story, helping them process their own thoughts, and letting them guide the conversation. But while her personal growth was undeniable, the weight of her past mistake lingered. Every now and then, she would run into Mr. Blackwell in the building, whether in the lobby, the elevator, or the parking garage. Each time, she would smile at him, a small but sincere gesture, and he would return the smile, his expression always calm, unaffected by their earlier encounter. He never mentioned it again. It was clear to her now that Mr. Blackwell didn't need to remind her of the lesson he had taught. He didn't need to rub it in or call attention to her change. His quiet demeanor, his grace in the face of adversity, had done all the teaching she needed. He had shown her what true strength looked like, not the strength of dominance or superiority, but the strength of quiet resilience, of standing firm in the face of ignorance, and of extending the same respect to others that you would demand for yourself. But Ms. Howell still had questions. She still had pieces of the puzzle that didn't quite fit, parts of her identity that she hadn't fully explored. One afternoon, after weeks of reflection, she decided to reach out to Mr. Blackwell, not for an apology, but to thank him. To thank him for opening her eyes and for showing her the power of humility and understanding. She called his office and asked if he would be willing to meet. A few days later, they arranged to meet at the same cafe where she had had her conversation with her friend. As she walked in, she saw him sitting at a corner table, his usual calm presence radiating from him as he waited. "Mr. Blackwell," she greeted, her voice warm, yet still tinged with the respect she had come to feel for him. "Ms. Howell," he replied with a small smile. "It's good to see you." They sat across from each other, and for a few moments, neither spoke. Ms. Howell took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. There was no script for this moment, no rehearsed lines. She simply needed to speak from the heart. "I wanted to thank you," she said finally, her voice steady but sincere. "I don't know if I've said it enough, but your words, the way you handled that situation, it changed me. It made me realize how much I had been blind to, how much I had overlooked in myself and in others. I thought I knew who I was, what I believed in, but the truth is, I had no idea. I was living in a bubble of assumptions and judgments. I was comfortable in my ignorance, and you made me realize that I needed to break out of that." Mr. Blackwell listened intently, his expression thoughtful. He nodded slowly, his hands folded neatly on the table. "I'm glad to hear that, Ms. Howell," he said quietly. "But you should know that the journey of understanding is a lifelong one. There will be times when you fall back into old habits, old ways of thinking. It's human. But what matters is what you do when you recognize those moments. When you catch yourself making assumptions, when you catch yourself judging someone before you really understand them. That's when the real work happens." Ms. Howell nodded, absorbing his words. "I'm ready for that work. I've made mistakes, and I'll make more in the future. But I want to be someone who is open, someone who listens, and someone who sees people for who they really are, not who I assume they are." He gave a slight smile, and for the first time, she saw a glimmer of pride in his eyes. That's all anyone can ask for. The fact that you're aware of your own limitations, that you're willing to grow, that's the most important thing. Remember, the world isn't perfect, and we can't fix all the wrongs. But we can choose how we respond to them. We can choose to be better people, every day. As their conversation continued, they spoke about many things, about life, about society, about their personal experiences. It was no longer just about that one moment in the lobby, it was about the ongoing process of growth and transformation that both of them were part of. The lesson that had begun with a confrontation had now blossomed into something much larger, something that would continue to shape both their lives. By the time they finished their coffee and parted ways, Ms. Howell felt lighter than she had in a long time. She knew that her journey was far from over. There would always be more to learn, more to unlearn, more to experience. But for the first time in a long time, she felt equipped to face the challenges ahead, armed with the knowledge that change was possible, and that empathy, respect, and understanding were not just ideals, but practices that could be cultivated every day. As she walked away from the cafe, she looked around at the world with new eyes, eyes that no longer saw only the surface, but that sought to understand, to learn, and to embrace the complexities that made each person, each experience, uniquely valuable. And in that moment, she knew that the lessons she had learned from Mr. Blackwell had shaped not only who she was becoming, but also who she would continue to be, the transformation. Months had passed since that life-changing encounter with Mr. Blackwell. Ms. Howell had been on a path of transformation, and although the journey had not been easy, it had been incredibly fulfilling. The old Ms. Howell, the one who walked through the world with an air of superiority and judgment, was no longer the person she saw in the mirror. In her place was someone who had begun to tear down the walls of bias and prejudice, someone who was beginning to understand the complex fabric of human experience. She had made a conscious effort to incorporate what she had learned into her daily life. Her interactions with people had become less about her own perceptions and more about truly connecting with others on a deeper level. Where once she had made snap judgments about people based on their appearance, their background, or their status, now she paused and took the time to listen. And while she had made significant progress, Ms. Howell knew that this wasn't a journey with an end. It was ongoing, each step revealing more about herself and the world around her. Every day was an opportunity to challenge her old beliefs, to unlearn something that no longer served her, and to grow into someone who was not just more aware but more compassionate. One afternoon, as she was walking through the lobby on her way to the elevator, she ran into someone she hadn't seen in a while, a resident from the building who had once been a colleague in her previous job. The woman, Eleanor, had always been cordial but distant. They hadn't spoken much over the years, and Ms. Howell had always assumed that their interactions had been shaped by their differing social circles. But as soon as Eleanor saw her, her eyes lit up with recognition. "Ms. Howell. It's been so long." Eleanor greeted, her voice warm and friendly. Ms. Howell smiled, feeling a genuine connection that had never been there before. "It has been a while, hasn't it? How have you been?" As they exchanged pleasantries, Ms. Howell could feel herself shifting. She no longer saw Eleanor through the lens of competition or superficiality. Instead, she saw a woman who had her own stories, her own struggles, and her own experiences. As they talked about their lives, Ms. Howell found herself asking questions she would never have asked before, questions about Eleanor's background, her family, her goals. She listened with interest, allowing Eleanor the space to share her thoughts. There was a moment during the conversation when Eleanor mentioned her recent struggles with her health and how she had been managing the stress of balancing work and family. For a split second, Ms. Howell felt the urge to offer advice, but she stopped herself. Instead of offering solutions, she simply said, "That sounds really tough. I can't imagine what it's like, but I'm here if you ever need to talk." Eleanor looked at her with surprise, as though she hadn't expected this level of empathy. "Thank you. That means a lot," she said softly. As the conversation came to a close, they exchanged contact information and promised to stay in touch. Walking away, Ms. Howell felt a sense of fulfillment, one that came not from the satisfaction of fixing someone's problem, but from the genuine connection that had been formed. She knew she had crossed an important threshold in her journey. She wasn't just listening to people now, she was truly understanding them. She was becoming someone who could be a friend, a confidant, and a source of support, not because she had all the answers, but because she was willing to be present with others, without judgment. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of small, meaningful interactions. Ms. Howell began volunteering at local community organizations, helping with outreach programs that supported underprivileged families and individuals. She wasn't there to preach or to show off her new self, she was there to listen, to learn, and to contribute in any way she could. It was in these moments that she truly began to understand the struggles of others, the challenges they faced, the obstacles they overcame, and the resilience they carried within them. One particular day, while volunteering at a local food pantry, Ms. Howell encountered a mother with 2 young children. The woman, whose name was Maria, was struggling to make ends meet after losing her job. As Ms. Howell helped organize the food packages, she couldn't help but notice Maria's exhaustion, her tired eyes, the way she hesitated before asking for help. There was no pride in her voice, only the humility of someone who had been through far more than she had ever imagined. "Are you okay?" Ms. Howell asked gently, noticing how Maria lingered near the back of the line. Maria looked up, startled by the question, but then her expression softened. "I'm just trying to make sure my kids get enough to eat. I'm not used to asking for help." Ms. Howell's heart ached as she listened. She knew that feeling, of not wanting to ask for help, of wanting to maintain some sense of dignity even in the face of hardship. She placed a hand on Maria's shoulder, offering what comfort she could. "It's okay to ask for help. Everyone needs a hand sometimes." In that moment, Ms. Howell realized that her transformation wasn't just about correcting her own flaws. It was about learning to connect with the world in a way that allowed her to see others, not as problems to be solved, but as people to be understood. She had come to realize that real empathy wasn't about fixing someone else's life, but about being present, about offering support and encouragement without trying to take control. The rest of the day at the food pantry was spent in meaningful conversation with others in need. And though Ms. Howell couldn't solve all their problems, she could offer kindness, understanding, and a listening ear. These small acts of connection, she realized, were just as important as any grand gesture. They were what truly made a difference in the world. As she left the food pantry that evening, the setting sun casting a golden hue over the city, Ms. Howell felt a deep sense of peace. She had come a long way since the day she had confronted Mr. Blackwell in the lobby. What had begun as a moment of shame had turned into an ongoing journey of self-discovery and growth. She had learned that true strength lay not in judgment or superiority, but in empathy and humility. The changes in Ms. Howell's life were no longer just about her personal growth, they were about her desire to create a better world, one where people could be seen for who they truly were, not for the labels society placed on them. She knew that the work wasn't over, that she would always have more to learn, but she was ready for the challenge. Every day was an opportunity to become a better version of herself, and with each step, she was moving closer to the person she had always wanted to be. The world around her had not changed overnight, but Ms. Howell had. And that, she realized, was the most important transformation of all.